What would you do if the people who were supposed to protect you decided, instead, that the most convenient thing they could do with you was to make you disappear? Her name was Rose Aldine, and she was 26 years old, and the people who decided this about her were her own family, specifically her two older brothers. Clement and Wade Aldine, who had managed the Aldine cattle operation in the Pecos Valley of New Mexico Territory since their father's death 4 years prior, and who had determined, in the spring of 1888, that a younger sister with a legal interest in the estate they were managing was a complication that the estate's continued consolidation would benefit from resolving, and that the resolution most consistent with their interests was the transfer of her inheritance interest to them. In exchange for a deed to a 40-acre parcel in the Jornada del Muerto, which was the desert basin south of Socorro that the Spanish had named the Journey of the Dead Man and whose reputation for lethality had not substantially improved in the 3 centuries since the naming. Rose had $5 and some coins when they put her on the southbound stage, and the deed to the 40 acres, and a carpetbag of clothes, and the particular, banked quality of anger that a woman carried when she had been wronged in a way that offered no immediate remedy but that she was absolutely certain was not the last word on the subject. The 40 acres were desert, rock and alkali flat and creosote scrub, without water and without shade and without any apparent quality that distinguished them from the surrounding 40,000 acres of identical desert, which were the characteristics that had recommended them to Clement and Wade as an appropriate resolution to the problem of their sister. What neither of them had taken the trouble to determine, because taking trouble to determine things about a piece of ground they were disposing of rather than acquiring had not seemed worth the time, was what lay beneath that ground, and what Rose Aldine would find when she began, with the systematic patience of a woman who had grown up watching her father red land before acting on it, to examine what she had been given rather than simply mourning what she had been made to give up. What she found beneath the alkali flat and the creosote scrub would not only make Rose Aldine the wealthiest landowner in the territory within 7 years but would transform the Jornada del Muerto from the place that killed travelers into the place that sustained them, restoring to the basin's scattered and struggling settlements the resource that the desert had been concealing from everyone who had crossed it without knowing how to ask the ground what it was actually holding. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Rose Aldine. If you have ever been handed the thing that was meant to finish you and found, in the handling of it, that it was actually the beginning, tell us in the comments, because tonight, this story belongs entirely to you. Rose had grown up understanding land in the specific, patient way of a cattle rancher's daughter who had been taken seriously, from an early age, by a father who had no sons for the first 12 years of his ranching life and who had therefore treated his eldest daughter as the person who would learn the work, with the result that Rose Aldine, by the time Clement was born and Wade 2 years after him, had already absorbed the greater part of what Edmund Aldine considered worth. Knowing about land and cattle and water and the specific grammar of the Pecos Valley's semi-arid character that determined everything a ranching operation in that country could accomplish. Edmund Aldine was not an educated man in the formal sense, but he was a learned one in the specific sense of a man who had spent 30 years paying close attention to the same piece of ground and had accumulated, across those 30 years, a knowledge of that ground that no formal education could have produced, because the knowledge was particular rather than general, rooted in the specific behavior of this soil and this water table and this grass species under these seasonal conditions rather than in the abstract principles that textbooks produced for conditions that were not any specific place's conditions. He had taught Rose to read the land before he had taught her to read books, which was not a rejection of literacy but a statement about priority, a reflection of his conviction that the most important reading a person who intended to live from land needed to do was the reading the land itself offered, and that this reading was prior to every other reading because every other reading was only useful in proportion to a person's ability to understand what they were actually standing on. He showed her how to identify the grass species that indicated soil depth and moisture retention, how to read the specific pattern of wash and channel in an arroyo system to understand the water's seasonal movement, how to find, in the slightly different color and texture of the surface soil in certain locations, the evidence of subsurface moisture at depths that the surface appearance would not suggest. He showed her how the basin's geology related to its water, explaining in the plain, practical language of a man who had arrived at geological understanding through observation rather than study that the basin's limestone underlayer held and moved water differently than the granite formations to the north, and that the implications of this difference for where water could be found and at what depth were the most important single fact about ranching in the country they lived in. Her mother, Adela, had given her the other half of the same inheritance, which was the ability to understand what she saw in its full human context rather than only its practical one. Adela had been the daughter of a Socorro merchant family, and she had brought to the Aldine ranch, when she married Edmund, a quality of social and historical awareness that complemented his practical knowledge in the way that a map's political and historical layers complemented its topographical ones, each necessary to understand the territory fully. She had taught Rose to read the basin's human history alongside its physical geography, explaining how the patterns of settlement and abandonment and resettlement across the Jornada del Muerto were not random but were expressions of the ground's character, of where the water was and where it wasn't, and of the gap between what the settlers had understood about that character and what the character actually was. She had taken Rose through the historical accounts of the basin's exploration, the Spanish period accounts that documented where the explorers had found water and where they had not and what had determined the difference, and she had noted, with the quiet emphasis of a woman who considered historical pattern one of the most reliable predictors of future reality, that the basin's documented water history showed a consistent gap between what travelers had found when they crossed it in the dry months and what the scattered settlement families who had stayed and looked carefully had found when they examined it through the full seasonal cycle. Rose had been, by the time her father's heart gave out in the autumn of 1884, the person who understood the Aldine ranch's land most completely, more completely than either of her brothers, who had grown up after the period of their father's primary teaching and who had received from Edmund not the comprehensive education he had given Rose but the more focused training of young men being prepared for the management role he expected them to occupy, a training more concerned with the commercial dimensions of ranching than with the geological and ecological foundations that Rose had absorbed in her earlier years. Clement and Wade were not incompetent ranchers, but they were ranchers of a different kind than their sister, men who managed what they had inherited rather than men who understood what the land they had inherited was actually capable of, and the distinction had not mattered while Edmund was alive and present to provide the understanding that supplemented their management, but it had mattered considerably in the 4 years following his death, during which the Aldine operation had continued to function competently without ever quite becoming what Edmund had believed it could become, because the people managing it had not fully understood what he had believed it could become and why. Rose had spent those 4 years in a position that was neither fish nor fowl in the household and in the operation, too knowledgeable about the land to be simply a domestic presence and too female in her brother's estimation to be a legitimate management voice. Her contributions accepted when they were presented indirectly and attributed to the brothers who adopted them, and declined when they were presented directly in contexts where their source was apparent. She had managed this without visible resentment, understanding that the resentment would cost her more than it would cost anyone else, and she had continued learning the land in the time she had available, walking the property on the pretext of domestic errands and accumulating observations about its character that she kept in a small notebook her father had given her and that she had filled with the same systematic notation Edmund had used in his own field records. It was this notebook that she had carried in the carpetbag when Clement and Wade put her on the southbound stage, and it was this notebook that had first given her the framework for understanding what the 40 acres in the Jornada del Muerto might be worth examining for, because Edmund's field records, which she had read thoroughly in the years after his death, had contained several references to the basin's southern section that had struck her as more substantively interested than his passing descriptions implied. The fall had arrived with a legal efficiency that suggested her brothers had been planning it longer than the week of conversation that preceded it. Clement had presented the proposal, the transfer of her inheritance interest in exchange for the 40-acre deed, as a generous accommodation of her need for independence, framed in the language of a man offering a gift while describing what was clearly a dispossession, and Wade had been present as witness and silent endorsement, and the document that effected the transfer had been prepared by a Roswell attorney whose relationship with Clement's commercial interests was too established to make his impartiality a reasonable assumption. Rose had read the document with the same attention she brought to any text whose implications she needed to understand before acting on it, and she had understood, within the reading, That the document was legally sound and practically inequitable, and that the combination was the specific kind of combination that left a person with the choice between accepting it and contesting it in a legal environment where her brother's resources and relationships made the contest expensive in ways she could not afford. She had accepted it, which was not the acceptance of defeat but the acceptance of a starting position, and she had been on the southbound stage within a week, which was as fast as Clement and Wade could arrange departure and as fast as Rose had no reason to delay it, because the 40 acres in the Jornada were not going to improve by waiting for her. She arrived in the desert southern basin in the first week of May, which was not the worst time to arrive in the Jornada del Muerto but was not the best time either, the spring heat already establishing the temperature baseline that the summer would significantly exceed. The 40 acres were as described, which was to say they were not encouraging, a flat expanse of alkali-crusted ground with a creosote scrub cover and a slight rise at the north end that might, in a less parched context, be called a ridge, and that in this context was simply the place where the ground was marginally more elevated than the surrounding flatness. She stood at the parcel's southern corner with her carpetbag and her notebook and her $5 and considered what she was looking at, not with the despair that anyone observing the consideration might have assumed was appropriate but with the same quality of suspended judgment that her father had taught her to bring to any unfamiliar piece of ground, the suspension of conclusion that allowed the ground to present itself rather than requiring it to conform to what she already thought. She walked the 40 acres that first afternoon in the methodical grid pattern Edmund had used for initial site assessments, walking north-south rows at 20-foot intervals and noting in the notebook what she found at each interval, the soil character and the surface moisture signs and the vegetation pattern and the specific character of the rock exposures where the alkali crust had eroded. She found, in the course of this walk, several things she had not expected to find and one thing that confirmed what her father's field records had led her to look for. The things she had not expected were the specific species of halophyte plants growing in 3 locations on the parcel's eastern section, plants that her mother's historical research had identified as the vegetation indicators that the Spanish period explorers had documented as reliable surface signals of subsurface fresh water at accessible depths in the basin's geology, plants that grew in the precise conditions of near-surface moisture that fresh water at depth produced through capillary action in the basin's specific soil profile. And the thing that confirmed what she had been looking for was a depression in the alkali crust at the parcel's northeastern corner, a depression whose specific oval character and whose orientation relative to the geological structures visible at the ridge's surface were consistent with the description Edmund had made in his field records of the kind of subsidence feature that formed above limestone dissolution voids, voids that in the Jornada del Muerto's hydrogeology were associated with the underground freshwater movement that the basin's surface aridity so thoroughly concealed. She dug her first test well by hand, using the short-handled spade she had purchased in Socorro with 2 of her $5, and she dug it at the northeastern depression center, working in the early mornings and late evenings when the heat was manageable and resting in the shade of the ridge through the midday hours, and she reached water at 11 feet on the 8th day of digging. Water that came up clear and cold and with the specific mineral character of limestone. Aquifer water rather than the surface-influenced character of the basin's shallow seasonal pools. She sat at the edge of the well shaft for a long time after the water appeared, not from exhaustion, though she was exhausted, but from the specific quality of feeling that arrived when a thing you have been working toward on the basis of evidence and training in your father's patient teaching reveals itself as actually, genuinely real rather than theoretically possible. What would you do with clean, cold water in the middle of the journey of the dead man? Rose Aldine would use it to ask, with the systematic patience of a woman who had been given 40 acres of desert and told it was a dismissal, what else the ground she had been given was concealing, and the answer to that asking would require the better part of 3 years and a second well and a third and the specific geological knowledge that her father had given her and that her mother's historical research had contextualized and that her brothers had never bothered to develop. And what it would produce was not simply the water itself but the understanding of the water's source and extent that made the water's development into something larger than a single ranch's water supply not only possible but, in the specific hydrogeological character of the Jornada del Muerto's limestone aquifer system, almost certainly inevitable once the right person had paid the right kind of attention to the right piece of ground. She had written to a geological survey office in Santa Fe in her second month on the property, describing her findings with the precision her father had taught her and enclosing the relevant sections of his field records as supporting documentation, and the survey geologist who had responded, a man named Aldous Frame, who had been conducting basin surveys in the territory for 15 years and who had, as his response indicated, been aware of the Jornada del Muerto's theoretical hydrogeological potential without ever having the specific surface evidence to translate the theory into a recommended investigation, had ridden out to the 40 acres in August and had spent 3 days examining what Rose had found and had returned to Santa Fe with a preliminary assessment that described the evidence as consistent with access to a regional aquifer system of potentially significant extent, which in the geologist's careful language meant that what Rose had found beneath her alkali flat was not an isolated occurrence but a surface expression of something considerably larger. The larger thing, as the subsequent survey work established across the following 2 years with Frame's assistance and the Territorial Geological Commission's eventual formal involvement, was an extensive limestone aquifer that underlay a substantial portion of the Jornada del Muerto's southern basin, an aquifer whose water was clean and consistent and recharged by the mountain precipitation that disappeared from the basin's surface without apparent consequence and that had been moving through the limestone formation at depth for long enough to have achieved the specific mineral equilibrium that made it, when accessed, superior drinking water to most of what the territory's other water sources produced. The aquifer's extent, as the survey established, was sufficient to support not only Rose's 40 acres but the scattered settlement families who had been struggling in the basin's southern section for a generation against the dual challenges of insufficient surface water and insufficient capital to drill the deep wells that the conventional wisdom of the period said were necessary to access reliable groundwater in the Jornada, a conventional wisdom that had been operating on the assumption that the basin's water was at the depths associated with the northern basin's geology rather than at the shallower depths that the southern section's different limestone formation made accessible, an assumption that the survey work, and Rose's original test well, had definitively corrected. Clement Aldine arrived at the 40 acres in the spring of Rose's 3rd year there, which was after the second well had been completed and after Frame's preliminary report had circulated through the Territorial Geological Commission and after the first of the settlement families had drilled their own shallower wells using the formation access information Rose had shared with them and had found water at the depths the survey predicted, and which was therefore well after Clement had understood that the 40 acres he had arranged to give his sister in exchange for her inheritance interest in the Aldine operation were not the dismissal he had intended them to be. He came with the composed courtesy of a man who had a transaction to propose and who had thought carefully about the framing, and he proposed the transaction with the same fluid language that had characterized the original exchange, offering to buy the 40 acres back at a price that was substantially above the assessed value of Alkali Desert and substantially below the value that an aquifer access property represented, the framing being designed to position the offer as generosity, rather than as the acknowledgement of a miscalculation that it actually was. Rose received the offer with the same quality of attention she brought to any document whose implications she needed to understand before acting on it, and she declined it with the same quality of clarity she brought to any conclusion that the evidence supported without ambiguity. She declined it because the 40 acres were not simply 40 acres but were the surface expression of something she had established and whose development she intended to complete, and because the development she intended was not the private maximization of the aquifer's value but the establishment of a water access framework for the basin's settlement families that would require the 40 acres to remain in her control as the operational center of a regional water distribution arrangement. That frame and the Territorial Geological Commission had been developing with her assistance across the preceding year. The arrangement, when it was formally established in the autumn of 1891, constituted the territorial government's first formal regional groundwater development authority, funded by a combination of territorial appropriation and the settlement family's collective contribution, administered from a headquarters on Rose's 40 acres, and designed to give the basin's scattered settlements the water access that their individual resources had not been able to achieve and that the aquifer system, properly developed, was entirely capable of providing. Clement did not pursue the matter beyond his initial offer, which was the behavior of a man who understood that pursuing it would require him to explain, in contexts where the explanation would be publicly visible, why he had arranged to give his sister a property that had turned out to be the access point for a regional aquifer, and why the arrangement had taken the legal form it had taken, and what his sister's inheritance interest in the Aldine estate had actually been worth. when he had exchanged it for the deed to 40 desert acres. He returned to the Pecos Valley and continued operating the Aldine Ranch, which was a competent operation on its own terms and which he continued to manage with the practical efficiency that had always characterized his approach to it, and he did not contact Rose again in any professional capacity, though she heard, through the Pecos Valley's commercial network, that he had become in subsequent years a reliable source of endorsement for the importance of thorough geological assessment before making property decisions, which she understood as the specific kind of wisdom that arrived after the occasion for its application had already passed. We come back now to the beginning, as we always come back, because the beginning is where the whole shape of what followed is first visible in its concentrated, unelaborated form, before events have given it the complexity that makes it harder to see clearly. Rose Aldine had been put on a southbound stage with $5 and a deed to 40 acres of Jornada del Muerto desert because two men had calculated that the desert would end her claim on anything worth having, and their calculation had rested on the assumption that the 40 acres were what they appeared to be, which was to say nothing worth having. The assumption had been wrong in the specific way that assumptions about land were wrong when they were made by people who had never been taught to read land rather than simply look at it, and the wrongness had been of the kind that compounded rather than diminishing across the years of the assumptions operation, because the aquifer beneath the alkali crust had been there and had been accessible and had been waiting, in the patient way of water in limestone, for someone who knew how to ask it the right question, and Rose Aldine was the specific person her father had spent the most important years of her childhood making into someone who knew how to ask land the right questions. She had walked the 40 acres on her first afternoon with the methodical grid pattern Edmund had used and with the suspended judgment he had taught her and with the notebook he had given her, and she had found the halophytes in the eastern section and the subsidence depression in the northeastern corner and had understood, from both, what they were offering to tell her about what the ground was actually holding, and she had dug the test well at 11 feet of hand labor and had reached, on the 8th morning, water so clean and cold that it had reoriented everything her brothers had intended the 40 acres to mean. Rose Aldine, who had stepped off a southbound stage in the Jornada del Muerto with $5 and a notebook and a father's teaching and a mother's historical awareness and the particular, banked quality of anger that comes from being wronged by people who should have known better, became the founding administrator of the Jornada del Muerto Water Authority within 4 years of her arrival on the 40 acres. And within 7 years the largest landowner in the Socorro district. Having acquired, through the water authority's operational requirements and through the commercial relationships that reliable water access in a desert territory produced with a reliable logic, a set of property interests that the territory's commercial press described as the most significant private land portfolio assembled in the Jornada's history. She kept Edmund's field records on the desk of the water authority's headquarters building, which she had built on the 40 acres northeastern corner, above the first well, and she kept beside them the notebook from her first afternoon's survey walk, and she found in their combination, on the evenings when the authority's operational demands had eased enough for reflection, the specific quality of gratitude that was not gratitude for what had been given her but gratitude for what she had been taught, because what she had been taught was what had made the giving of the desert into a gift rather than a disposal, and the distinction between those two things was, in the end, the whole of the story. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight, and with Rose, and with Edmund Aldine, who spent the most important years of his daughter's childhood teaching her to read land in a territory where reading land was the difference between what you had been given and what you could make of it. If this story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to be reminded that the thing given as a disposal is sometimes the thing given as a gift, and that the difference between the two is entirely in what the person who receives it knows how to do with it. And we would love to know, what is something that was meant to finish you that turned out, instead, to be the beginning of something you could not have found any other way? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay close.